Thank you, Mr. Rao, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today for this presentation, which will, while this is rescheduled, will be the last of this webinar series. We hope that you have been able to attend most of them and gain from the experience. Our contact details are available and will be presented again at the end of this presentation, and we'll be very happy to receive any questions, doubts, clarifications, queries, suggestions that you might have. Either on a specific subject or on the general webinar series and your experiences of that. So we end effectively today with a session on compliances for the services businesses. Obviously, service is a very broad term, and my colleagues Christopher Manoharan and Zahid Taraftar, who will be taking you through today's presentation, will try and give you the various facets of what we mean by services and how services are impacted by compliances. There is a general misconception that services businesses are not as not as regulated, and therefore do not need to worry as much about compliance as manufacturing businesses. But as this presentation will show, that is not necessarily the case. And if you're running a services business or if you're planning to start one, you do need to focus and get your compliances in place from day one. So without further ado, I'll pass on the presentation to Christopher and Zahid. Over to the two of you. We will take about an hour for the presentation, and we'll be very happy to take any questions that you might have at the end of it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Indranil. Thank you everybody for joining this session on compliances for services businesses. Throughout this presentation, we will be looking at what do we understand by services industry and services sector. We will look at case laws which clarify what services include and what they exclude. We will look at the definition of service given under various laws which define it. We will also discuss what are the differences between manufacturing sector and services industry and how judicial pronouncements have helped differentiating between these two categories of businesses. We will end by telling how to provide quality services without really compromising on your compliance requirements, and we will also tell what are the best practices which are currently followed across various service sector industries to ensure that they meet all the required compliance requirements. We will first start by giving a brief introduction of what do we understand by service industry. Now, to a layman, of course, the service sector covers a wide variety of activities, including real estate, business services, financing, transportation, storage, communication, all activities connected to storage and communication, insurance activities, community services, social and personal services, any type of trade, hotel, restaurants, and entertainment businesses are covered in the service sector. In this slide, we will talk about the definition of how Consumer Protection Act 1986 and how the Service Tax Act covers services. First, let us talk about how services is defined under the Consumer Protection Act. It says that it includes activities like banking, financing, insurance, transport, processing, supply of electrical or other energy related services, board and lodging or both, housing construction, entertainment, and amusement. As we all know, the Consumer Protection Act has been drafted in order to protect the rights of consumers, to ensure that there is no deficiency of service which is provided, and these are the things which the Consumer Protection Act considers to be services. Now let's move on to the Service Tax Act 1994. It includes various services like work contract services, broadcasting services, business auxiliary service, clearing and processing house services, commercial training or coaching services, courier activities, credit rating agencies activities. So these credit rating agencies who rate various organizations on the basis of any predetermined gradation or predetermined fields criterias, those are also, their activities are also covered as services under the Service Tax Act. Then we have the dredging services, healthcare services, underwriting services, storage and warehousing services. These are the activities which are covered as services under the Service Tax Act. Now, before we really get into the nitty-gritties and integrities of the service sector or the service industry, let us focus on how India's growth in terms of the service sector is currently stands. These are some, and in the next slide we are talking about, we have taken some reports, some extracts from various reports, which tells that India is really poised for growth. The service sector in India is really poised for growth. Now, in services sector, India's world rank is 11, and the GDP is $1,185 billion. Now, this has been taken from the Planning Commission, Government of India. Again, another report tells that India's service sector grew through 10%, which is as per the CII report in the last year, which is 2015-16. Now, the IT BPM sector has demonstrated a flexibility as per the economic survey which has been conducted, and the estimated share is of 9.5% of GDP and more than 45% in total services export, which has been done in the year 2015-16. Similarly, you can see that there are other reports which also say that the services sector in India is really we are looking at a big picture if we consider the service sector which India is currently poised for. Moving on to the next slide. Here we will talk about service, how service, the term service has been interpreted by different case laws. The first one we will take up is a case which was reported in the year 2009, which says that supply of electricity to a consumer would be covered under Section 210 of the Consumer Protection Act, which means that if there is a deficiency of supplying electricity to any consumer, that would amount to an action that would lead to an action being taken for deficiency of services under the Consumer Protection Act. Again, in another case law, which is a little later in 1992, it was said that services rendered for consideration by private medical practitioners, private hospitals, and nursing homes must be constituted as service for the purpose of Section 210 of the Consumer Protection Act. In Indian Medical Association versus VP Shanta and others, which was reported in the year 1995, it was held that services rendered at a government hospital, health center, or dispensary where no charge whatsoever is made from any person availing the services, and all patients, whether rich or poor, are given free service, is outside the purview of the expression service. But in the same case, it was held that if the service which was provided by this hospital is chargeable, but somebody is not being able to pay due to lack of funds, then also in the second case, it will be considered as service. So if it is provided, if any service is provided for free, that falls outside the purview of Consumer Protection Act. But even if it is chargeable, if somebody is merely not being able to pay because of lack of funds, that will not render that service to be outside the definition of service as given under the Consumer Protection Act. In another case versus the Employees State Insurance Corporation, we find that medical service rendered in the ESI hospital dispensary is again getting covered under the Consumer Protection Act, under the definition of service as given under Consumer Protection Act. In Lucknow Development Authority versus M.K. Gupta, which was reported in the year 1994, the definition of service was said to include it not only day-to-day buying and selling activity undertaken by a common man, but even such activities which are otherwise not commercial in nature, yet they partake of a character in which some benefit is conferred on the consumer. That is, it tells you that the definition of service can never be exhaustive, and that is how law gets treated from time to time. We have found that the case laws help us in understanding the definition of various terms, and service is no exception to that. Moving on, we will now talk about the statutory definition of service as given under the Finance Act 2012 and the Consumer Protection Act. We just discussed few case laws under the Consumer Protection Act. Now, under the Finance Act, service means any activity carried out by a person for another for consideration, and includes a declared service, but shall not include, it has certain exceptions, which tells an activity which constitutes merely a transfer of title in goods or immovable property by way of sale, gift, or in any other manner. So transfer of property is not a service, as the definition is given under Finance Act. It also excludes a transaction in money or actionable claim. A provision of service by an employee to the employer in the course of or in relation to his employment, and the fees taken in any court or tribunal established under any law for the time being in force. These are excluded from the definition of service as given under the Finance Act. Now let us look at the definition of service given under the Consumer Protection Act. Under the Consumer Protection Act, service means service of any description which is made available to potential users and includes, but is not limited to, the provision of facilities in connection with banking, financing, insurance, transport, processing, supply of electrical or other energy, board or lodging or both, housing, construction, entertainment, amusement, or the purveying of news or other information. So the broadcast and media industry is also getting covered under the services, definition of services under Consumer Protection Act, but it does not include the rendering of any service free of charge or under a contract of personal service.
Well, now we come to the thin line between manufacturing and services industries. If we go to the definition of what services mean, we will now look at each of the different aspects of what the thin line is between manufacturing and services. In the first square, you see a restaurant business. A restaurant is a business establishment which prepares and serves food and drink in return for money, which is paid before the meal or after the meal. And apart from manufacturing various dishes, there is also a service element involved in the service provided by a restaurant. A restaurant also manufactures food items and then serves the same, of which the service portion is only 40% and the total amount balance is 60%. Represents goods or for manufacturing activity. Now, if you really look at it, when we normally look at the business that is being provided by a restaurant, although there is a huge manufacturing component, which is probably about 60%, it is still called a service. And a service tax is charged on the entire component of services which is being provided by the restaurant. Now let's go to the next square, which talks about job work. What is a job work? A large number of industries depend on outsiders for support for many things like testing, processing of raw material, and for completing and semi-completing the manufacturing process. The activity undertaken by these small industries to complete the process on raw materials and semi-finished goods, as decided by the principal manufacturer, is known as job work. So in other words, packets of work which are basically required for a huge industry. Say for example, if it's an automobile industry and there's a car manufacturing factory, there are a lot of automobile parts which need to be outsourced really. So for example, the plastic components of the car, there is navigation equipment, there is equipment with respect to the headlights. These kinds of accessories, critical accessories for the car, is normally outsourced. The basic requirements of the car, like the chassis and the external covering of the car, is manufactured in the industry. So all this outsourced bits and pieces which get manufactured outside and which is then brought into the major industry is basically done through the job work process. So if the job work process is undertaken by the job worker, then it amounts to manufacture. The job worker would be liable to pay excise on the duties for manufacture. Where the process undertaken by the job worker does not amount to manufacture, the said job work could be liable to service tax. So, for example, if the painting of that particular car does not happen in the industry but gets outsourced to a third party, then that particular service of painting is liable to service tax. So, this basically is the difference between a restaurant business and something like a job work. So job work is normally, as I said, susceptible to normally is susceptible to service excise tax, whereas the process that is undertaken in certain cases could also be susceptible to service tax in certain cases. So when there are components of both in a particular service rendering, one needs to actually try to analyze and see which is a major portion of the kind of service rendering that is being delivered. If the service rendering is more in the form of a service, then service tax is going to be liable. It's going to be liable for service tax, or it could also be that the particular service falls under the definition of services under the Service Tax Act. So although there could be a major component of manufacturing in that particular service, it is still treated as a service tax and liable for it is still treated as a service and liable for service tax. Similarly, in a job work situation where that particular process that is involved in the job work, if it is treated as a process of manufacture for the purposes of the excise tax, then irrespective of there being a huge service component to it, it could still be treated as a process of manufacture, and excise could be leviable on it. Similarly, if the process that is being rendered to the major industry is in the form of a service, although there is a huge manufacturing component to it, and the service is defined under the services tax, then the what would be applicable would be service tax and not excise. Going to the last panel, you can see below, software can also be liable to service tax, VAT, excise duty, customs duty, etc., depending on the nature of transaction, whether it is a sale of goods or service or both. So here, similarly, there'll be it's a similar situation that applies. So under the service tax, if you're able to categorize software as a service and say that what is being rendered is purely a service and there is no good component or no hardware component to it, then service tax is going to be applicable. However, if you are going to have a hardware component to it, or if you're going to have even an application component to it, where in certain cases, if the definition under that particular act states that the definition includes goods, the definition of goods also includes software. If there is a definition in either the excise or the customs duty or the VAT Act which states that the definition of goods also includes software in some form, then it will fall under the definition of goods, and the relevant VAT, excise or customs duty will be leviable. So we need to actually look at the definition under each of these acts to decide whether what is being levied, what is being charged to tax is a good or a service. So accordingly, you will have to see if the service that is being provided, that is being rendered, whether it falls under good or whatever other definition that is mentioned under that particular act, or it falls under service or whatever the other definition that is mentioned under the act, to make that particular duty or tax applicable. Packaging services. Now we come to what are basically packaging services. Packaging services means packaging of goods, including pouch filling, bottling, labeling, imprinting of the package, but does not include any packaging activity that amounts to manufacture within the meaning of clause F of section 2 of the Central Excise Act. So it's very clear that packaging activity, it does not include any packaging activity that amounts to manufacture within the meaning of clause F of section 2 of the Central Excise Act, making the whole packaging activity fall under the definition of services. So there is also a Supreme Court decision, if you see, which we put out there, where the Supreme Court has held that the manufacture of fertilizers would be complete only upon loading them into bags, which would make it marketable. The Supreme Court held that without the packing activity, the fertilizers would not be marketable. So, thus, when the packaging activities become ancillary to the manufacturing process, it becomes part of manufacture. Otherwise, it will be part of services, and service tax will be levied. Cleaning activity. We come to the next panel. Here, cleaning activity means cleaning, including specialized cleaning services such as disinfecting, exterminating, or sterilizing of objects or premises of various commercial or industrial buildings, of factories, of tanks or reservoirs or industrial buildings. But it does not include services in relation to agriculture, horticulture, animal husbandry, or dairy. When the cleaning activities become ancillary to the manufacturing process, it becomes part of manufacture of the product. So what we see here is, it's very clear that if you are able to differentiate between the cleaning activity and the manufacturing process, then you can call it a service. But if the cleaning activity becomes ancillary to the manufacturing process, then it becomes part of the manufacturing of the product. We come to the next panel, which is services that a manufacturer provides to the end consumer. So there are various services that the manufacturer can also provide. For example, you have, after the product is basically sold and it comes to the market, then there is normally a warranty that is associated with the product, which comes into effect after the sale. So during the period of warranty, you can always approach the company that has sold you the product for servicing the product for a particular period. There could also be an annual maintenance contract. So this annual maintenance contract could be factored into the price of the product or could be charged separately. In either case, what is being sold is the service of maintenance. So for a particular period after the product is sold, if you have paid the consideration that is required, you will be eligible to a maintenance on the product. And this particular maintenance or this particular warranty is a service that is provided by the company. So under this maintenance scheme, you can also avail of any repairs that the product has undergone. You can also avail of any kind of overhauling of the product in order to keep the product running. We'd also like to take you to the last case, which is this case on Satnam Overseas Limited versus the Commissioner of Central Excise. So here, a certain process would be treated as manufacture only if the new product is known to the market, came into existence with the original product losing its original character. Mere addition to the product would not make the product different. If the primary and essential character of the product remains the same, there has to be a transformation of the product into a new commodity, commercially a distinct commodity by itself. So in this particular case, where it was with respect to a particular type of grain, which was, the texture of it was slightly changed and it was sold in the market, the court said that just because the texture of it is changed and it being sold in the market, it cannot be termed as manufacture because the grains remain the same and did not undergo any huge major change. Thus, when any activity like packaging, cleaning, polishing, repairing, etc., which in general parlance denotes type of services, and they become ancillary to the manufacturing process, only then it becomes a part of the manufacture. If it is not ancillary to the process of manufacture, then it cannot be a part of the manufacture.
Thank you, Christopher. Now we know that what are the differences between the manufacturing sector and service sector, especially in the light of the last case law which we discussed, which Christopher talked about. It clearly lays down that in order to become a new product or to be considered as manufacture, new absolutely separate product has to come into the market, which has to be distinct from the ingredients or from the constituent products which have gone into its manufacture. Now, on the next slide, we will quickly touch upon the various compliances on the basis of activity, how we can differentiate there. So we will look at three basic, there are various activities which a company has to go through, be it in the manufacturing sector or the services sector. But for the purpose of this slide, we will be looking at three basic activities, which are start of operations, ongoing compliances, and shifting or closure of operations. As we all know, with start of operations, there are various registrations, approvals, permissions, licenses, consents under pollution laws which have to be obtained. Then comes the ongoing compliances which require us to file periodic returns, various reports. There are display requirements under various laws which we have to put up notices. There are maintenance of registers and records requirements which are given under various laws, especially the labor law, and maintenance of policy documents which have to be in line with the legal requirements. We will talk about this in the later slide, and payment obligations. Shifting or closure of operations will again call for sending notices under various labor enactments, including the primary regulator under which the various registration, approvals, permissions have been obtained at the start of operations. Notices of closures have to be filed under the Industrial Disputes Act. There are various case laws which have clearly come up, and so activities which are falling under services also getting covered under the Industrial Disputes Act. Full and final settlements of employees have to be made with a closure of operations. Now we will look at the compliances which are there on the basis of other aspects. First of them is the industry. So basis what type of service industry I'm falling in, my industry specific laws will differ. For telecommunications, as we all know, the TRAI is the regulator. For ITES companies, depending on what kind of services I'm providing, my laws will differ. For research and development related services, automobile sector, retail, tourism and hospitality, healthcare, education and training, and media and entertainment services, all my laws, my industry specific laws will keep differing. The next aspect is on the basis of location, whether I am located in any particular state or a union territory will define which are the laws, which are the local laws, which have to be clubbed with the central enactment, or whether it will be a Shops and Establishment Act read with the Shops and Establishment rules, or laws like the Minimum Wages Act, which we all know is a central act, has to be clubbed with the state rules. Those factors will depend on what are the locations where my operating units are situated. Another aspect is strength of employees or workmen which we have hired for providing services or carrying out the business. Laws like EPF, ESI, Contract Labor Act, Interstate Migrant Workmen Act. There are various provisions under the Industrial Disputes Act which get triggered upon crossing a certain threshold of employees. Now, here is, in the next slide, we are looking at a sample list of laws which would be applicable on the service sector. Now, there are certain laws which are definitely applicable. This is again on the basis of, we all know that EPF Act, there is an applicability threshold of 20 employees. But considering that many companies will cross that number, even if within the next first to second year of the start of operation, but eventually they will cross that threshold. We have included this as part of the definite applicable list. There is Payment of Bonus Act, there is ESI Act, there is Gratuity Act, Electricity Act, there is Industrial Disputes Act, Equal Remuneration Act, Information Technology Act becomes a very critical part of the services sector, industry, the Fire Safety Act, the Professional Tax enactments. These are all your definitely applicable laws. Then we have listed down some maybe applicable laws like the Legal Metrology Act. If you are into packaging or using any type of weights and measures for your service industry, this law will become applicable. depending on what type of effluent or what type of emissions you are, even having a diesel generator set in your premises will trigger laws like the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act. The EIA notification, which is again a pollution enactment, depending on whether you are falling inside the schedule or not, this law would become applicable. The Petroleum Act lays down that if you cross a certain threshold of storing petroleum within your premises, you'll have to obtain a license from the authority. The Bureau of Indian Standards Act, now a normal understanding is it's only applicable in the case of manufacturing, but there are various processes which are followed in the services sector also. So there is a standard identification mark for those processes as well. The Biomedical Waste Management Rules 2016. Now, this law, although from the name itself, it tells that it's primarily applicable to health sector, but in case you have a medical facility or you give first aid to your employees within your organization, there is a requirement of obtaining clearance from the authority in order to dispose those biomedical waste, the cotton buds which you use in your premises, in order to provide first aid to your employees. The e-waste management rules 2016, now both the rules have come into force, replacing the old rules which were there. The Motor Vehicles Act, if there are motor vehicles which are registered in the name of a company, be it for moving your employees from one place to other, or for any other activity related to your industry, related to your operations. The Food Safety and Standards Act will depend on whether you have a canteen, in-house canteen for providing food to your employees, and food is getting cooked or stored in your premises. This law would become applicable. Now we will walk into the various processes, well-established processes, which are to be adhered to in order to ensure that you are providing your services without compromising on the compliance requirements. Now, we have tried to break it up into two processes. The first one we'll talk about for companies which have for entities which have an existing process to ensure that the day-to-day compliances are met. And the second one is for companies which currently do not have any process to ensure that the compliances are getting adhered to. In the first one, where there is an existing process within the company, we recommend that a gap analysis from time to time should be carried out in your company to find out whether, due to any expansion of operations within the company or any shortening of operations within the company, some laws have ceased to be applicable to your operations, or whether any additional compliances and laws have come into the picture. This gap analysis or an audit has to be carried out from time and again to ensure that all your operations, business operations, are covered by the existing legal compliances which are applicable to them. In the second process, which is without any existing system or mechanism to track compliance requirements, we recommend that the first step should be, in order to know what are the compliance requirements, what are the laws, you should perform a compliance, you should have an effective compliance management system. The first step of which would definitely include knowing your regulatory environment, mapping all your business activities to the various legal compliance requirements inside your company. Now, as both these processes join hands, we see that there are certain, in the bottom part of the slide, we see that there are certain standard processes which have been laid out, like aligning company policies, internal policies with statutory compliances that are either existing or are identified as applicable, which is of course happens subsequent to the gap analysis, which has to be carried out from time to time. The next step is planning out a compliance map for contingent events. Now, we all know that in order to run a business, there are various contingencies which might happen. There are various occurrences which might require additional compliances to be met. there should be a plan to ensure that in case any of such contingent event occurs, in case of fire or in case of resignment of a board of a member from the board, what are the steps which needs to be adhered to ensure that all the filings and all the compliances are met. Legal audit, we have already talked about. Ongoing compliance monitoring, we talked about maintaining of registers, putting up of display notices. An audit from time to time is highly recommended to ensure that you are complying with all the requirements which are given under the law. Training and education of your employees and having centers of excellence. Identifying personnel within your organization who will take charge of various departments. By department, I mean to say your administration department, your finance department, your statutory compliance department, your corporate secretarial department. People who will be responsible to ensure that all compliances which are applicable to a particular department are getting completed from time to time as has been given under the law. For that, these people who will head those center of excellences must have the team members who should be trained and educated with the compliance requirement and also what your company internal company policy has to say. Risk and control assessments, we will talk about this in the next slide. We all know that as a company, as an entity, you will have to take call whether you would want to maintain a register under a law merely by maintaining a register under the law or displaying a notice of holiday under the law or getting the renewal certificate, the certificate of registration renewed within time. Which would be more important for you? You will have to assess the compliances, escalate and highlight those compliances, bring those compliances up in the priority list which are more risk averse, which are calling for more risk for your company, for your company's operations as well as reputation. The last one is documentation and preservation of law. We all know that all the laws, including the fiscal laws like income tax, they all recommend that all your documentation, records and registers must be preserved for a certain number of days or years in many cases from the last date of entry. Why is that done? In order to ensure that you are not only doing your compliances on a daily basis, when the inspectors or the authorities visit your premises, they would also want to know how good or bad you are doing 2 years down the line, 2 years before than your from the date on which they are visiting. Moving on to the next slide, we will talk about companies having existing compliance management processes. We will get into a little depth here about this process. As we mentioned a little while ago, for companies having existing compliance management processes, what we recommend as step one is doing a gap analysis of the existing process to ensure that all applicable compliances and all applicable statutes are covered. If your checklist requires some editing, this is the activity which will help doing that editing for adding compliances which have become subsequently applicable and for letting go those compliances which have ceased to be applicable due to any change in operations. The next step which we are talking about here is fill in the gaps. How? You need to ensure that your checklist of compliances, your applicable compliances which you think to be which you think that are applicable to your company remains updated at all times. So this gap analysis has to be carried out at a regular interval and at a determined frequency. We talked about training your company officials and personnel. That becomes very critical for companies to prosper in this gap analysis process, because unless you train your people what are the documents, what are the filings, what are the registers they should have in place, this activity of performing gap analysis cannot be done very smoothly. The last part is by allocating duties, by allocating responsibilities. We talked about having center of excellences, ensuring that personnel within your organization are made responsible for particular departments, giving them a team of at least 1 or 2 people to ensure that all information, all filings, everything is getting properly completed and maintained.
Now we come to companies not having existing compliance management processes. Now, if you're a company which does not have existing compliance management processes, then you need to have a comprehensive compliance landscaping. What is a comprehensive compliance landscaping? It is identifying the applicable statutes that your company or organization has to comply with. It is to detect if any exemptions are notified by the central or state government as applicable to your unit or company. For example, if you're a factory that is located at an SEZ, or if you're a factory which by its very nature, if your industry by its very nature falls under a certain exemption, then you will need to show those exemptions so that we are sure that those particular provisions of law are not going to be applicable to you. So, say for example, in Karnataka under the Shops and Establishments Act, there is a certain requirement that women will need to work only from a certain period time in the morning to a certain time in the evening. Now, there is an exemption for the IT industry by virtue of which this particular requirement has been relaxed, and women can also work beyond the stipulated hours. So you will need to provide us with those exemptions. In most cases, we will be able to detect it ourselves, but if there is any particular exemption that is specific to your particular industry or your particular company, you will need to provide us with it so that we can be sure if a particular statute or a particular provision of law is not applicable to you. So with this in mind, we will identify the statutes that your company or organization has to comply with. You will have to create effective compliance management system. Now, what do we mean by this? It means that you need to create appropriate structures which report directly to the leadership of the management or the board of directors. What is an effective compliance management system? An effective compliance management system mitigates the adverse impacts on achieving certain objectives. So, number one, when you have an effective compliance management system, your management and your board of directors will at any point in time be able to generate reports from the tool which you're using to be able to see the degree of compliance and non-compliance that is at present applicable or at present there in the organization, and take steps to ensure more compliance, or be happy with the state of compliance in case the compliance is really good, and be able to disseminate the same to the shareholders concerned. This in turn will increase the value of your organization with the shareholders. Also, having an effective compliance management system mitigates the various adverse impacts which could arise if you are able to actively and effectively manage this particular tool. So if you're able to operate this tool in a way that gives you maximum efficiency, then what is essentially going to happen is that various adverse impacts in terms of getting a notice from an inspector for non-compliance with various provisions. It could mean that you have not taken, it could mean a notice from the municipal authorities that you don't have a license for your lift. It could mean a notice from the inspector that you do not have your certificate of registration under the Shops and Establishments Act. It could mean a notice from the register that you don't have your leave register under the Shops and Establishments Act. It could mean so many other such compliances which you are not in compliance with, and this notice, if not responded to appropriately, could result in penalties in the form of fines and also imprisonment, which could result in a lot of reputational loss to the organization. So, to that extent, we need to ensure that there is an effective compliance management system in place. The third aspect of ensuring a compliance management process is to allocate duties. Now, the first point in this connection is all the compliance activities need to be segregated and allocated department-wise. The human resource management department will take care of certain set of laws, which we normally call as labor and employment related laws. The finance department will take care of certain laws, which we normally call the fiscal compliance, which is all the fiscal statutes like the service tax, the income tax, and now you have the GST, which is going to come into vogue. The company secretary will handle the various corporate compliances. So it is essential to allocate these compliances under the various laws in a rational manner so that the departments that are most able to handle those particular compliances are allocated those compliances. The company should have an effective mechanism in place to review and keep a check on the compliance activities done by the personnel to whom it was allocated, and the same should be done before the date of compliances arrive. So one of the ways in which you can do it is you need to have a method in which you have triggers in place which remind you periodically about the requirement to have a certain compliance completed, so that there is no adverse impact of having to receive a notice or any other kind of a adverse impact which might arise in the future. Practices to be followed for effective compliance management. Now we come to certain practices which we normally follow to ensure that there is effective compliance management. We'll have to align company policies with the statutory compliances that are either existing or identified as applicable. In many cases, you will not be able to tell your employees that these are the various statutes that are applicable to you, so you need to ensure compliance with those statutes, because in most cases, many of them might not even have gone through a legislation. So you will need to capture essential aspects of those enactments and put them in the form of a policy and disseminate that policy company-wide or organization-wide so that everybody has access to that policy and they're able to read and understand that policy and implement that policy in their daily working lives. So one important policy that you need to keep in place is the prevention of sexual harassment at workplace. So as you know, this is an important policy that has now gained a lot of notice, especially in view of the various incidents of sexual harassment that one is hearing of in workplaces, and which has also gained a lot of publicity. So in view of this, it is very important to have a sexual harassment policy in place to ensure that that women are not harassed in any form. And it clearly defines what sexual harassment is, what needs to be done in case a sexual harassment takes place, what are the various actions that need to be taken, both by the victim as well as by the organization, in order to ensure that the issue is that the incident is taken care of, that the victim's grievances are redressed, and the harasser, the person who is being charged with the sexual offense is accordingly punished. So to that extent, it is very important to have a policy of prevention of sexual harassment at the workplace. You also need to have the other policies which my colleague will take over.
Thank you, Christopher. Now, the next up is waste management policy. Now, there are two new laws which have come into picture, which differentiates between construction waste and with a generic waste. So now, definitely for services industry, we're talking about the generic waste. Now, you must have things like paper, glass, plastic in your offices. Now, under the law, you are required to dispose them off in a particular way and in a particular bin to have of a specific color, and which should have some labels also put on it, so for others to understand. Third important thing is the Maternity Benefit Act, which we all know. You must have a maternity benefit policy which covers all the aspects of the Maternity Benefit Act. Now, again, like the Maternity Benefit Act, all laws, especially the labor legislations, undergo changes time and again. Your policies have to be updated in as many times as it is required to keep it in line with the legal requirement as on date.
The fourth aspect is the leave policy. The leave policy is basically, it needs to be structured in such a way as the employees are able to make out as to what is the leave that is allocated to them on an annual basis, how much of leaves that they can take, so that they are completely aware of the requirement under the law, and they are also completely aware of the resultant consequences if they take leave in excess of the requirements under the policy. So the number of leaves that are that employee can avail of is normally, in case it's an establishment, it is mentioned under the Shops and Establishments Act, and in case it is a factory, it is mentioned under the Factories Act. You also need to have an IT policy in place. And IT policy it's very essential to have an IT policy in place for the simple reason that an IT policy helps to demarcate between essential and non-essential data, and what is essential data, and if it is essential data, you have data with respect to personal data, or in other words, private data, and how this particular data should actually be preserved, should be obtained, should be preserved, and should be further disseminated. So that is one aspect of the IT policy. The IT policy also needs to take care of what you put up on your website, and what is the kind of information you gather from both your service providers and from your clients. And the IT policy needs to have in place the various aspects of consent, saying that it needs to say in the if it is going to be a policy that is put up on the web, it needs to say that the moment you click on this button and say accept, it means that you accept the terms of this privacy policy, and you agree that the information that is being provided by you will be used by the organization for the purposes mentioned herein. So among the purposes, you should also ensure that the purposes is in line for the purposes for which it is intended to be used, and for no other purpose. So for example, if you're taking the credit card numbers and the name and the age and the and some medical information like the blood group of the person, you should only be using it for processing that particular credit card information, which you will need to have in place for identifying that particular person, and for no other purpose. Absolutely, you cannot be passing on that information to any third party in any form whatsoever. So and again, if it is credit card information, you should only be taking information which is essential for those purposes. So as I said, information with respect to medical records, blood group will not be taken. You only need to have the person's bank account. You need to have that person's name. You need to have that person's sexual identity, gender, and only basic things that are required for processing credit cards, and probably the credit card number. These are and the password, the password of the particular person, and the address of the particular person. These are the important information that you will require. So you will need to be very careful as to the kind of information you obtain for the particular business process that you are carrying out. You cannot obtain more information than what is required for the particular business process that is being carried out, and you should disseminate that information also in a manner that is in line with the with your IT policy. So you should not be passing on that information to probably a bank, which is using that information to get more business from you. So that will be very unethical, and in fact, it will be illegal as well. So these are aspects you need to keep in mind. You need to, in your in your website, you also need to mention that mention who the grievance redressal officer is, and you need to give his address and his email address. So these are important aspects that you need to take care of under the IT policy. The IT policy has to be framed in accordance with the data privacy rules, which have been enacted under the Information Technology Act. The last point that we are coming to is company ethics. Now, company ethics are basic ethics that a company follows. So each company treasures a set of values which it inculcates within the organization, so that the culture within the organization is makes its employees have a sense of belonging, and gives its employees a sense of well-being and happiness. So to that extent, when we're speaking of company ethics, there could be ethics with respect to dress code. That is, a certain dress code needs to be followed within the organization. There could be aspects with respect to soft skills, ways in which emails should be sent and received, methods in which communication should be sent within the organization. So there are various such aspects, basically, which are soft values, and also values with respect to conduct within the organization, which form a part of company ethics. And another important aspect of company ethics is the gift policy. So during important occasions like Diwali or any other major festival, there is this whole aspect of giving gifts. So today we have in the US, you have legislations like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In India also you have the Corruption Act. So your giving of gifts should not be in violation of these enactments, and you should capture important aspects from these enactments and put it as a part of your policy, so that as and when you are gifting something to somebody, you need to ensure that you don't violate those particular points. Those particular points with respect to gifting, majorly that being that they don't exceed a certain value, that they are not something that is given to public servants, to people in to people in government, but rather given to independent parties which have a commercial relationship with you. So these are important aspects that you need to take care of to develop your own company ethics. So what are the practices to be followed for effective compliance management? There are other practices also that you need to follow for effective compliance management, and these are, some of them are to plan out a compliance map for contingent events. So why do we need to plan out a compliance map for contingent events? Because contingent events could come up at any point in time, and you need to know how to manage those particular contingent events. So some of these contingent events could be the resignation of a director and appointment of a director. So you need to know what you need to do when a director suddenly resigns. What are the laws? What are the steps that you need to follow to appoint a director in the place of the director who's moving out? There could be other contingent events, like probably a fire in the premises. So what do you do when an incident like that happens? A notice has to be given to the fire department, to the authority in the fire department concerned, and accordingly you need to take mitigation measures to ensure that this kind of an activity, this kind of an incident doesn't happen again. So this is basically to create a compliance map for various kinds of. So you will have to identify what are the various contingent events that your organization is susceptible to, or your organization is exposed to, depending on the kind of organization that you are. if you're an organization that is in the business of explosives, then you need to make sure that you are following various steps to ensure that the various contingent events are taken care of in case of a blast in the factory. Training and education. Uh, Sorry, before that we'll go to the second slide, legal audit. So, and legal audit is important for ongoing compliance monitoring purposes. Now, what do we mean by legal audit? It is to ensure that there is a checklist that is very scrupulously followed, and that particular checklist is used to check whether there are some basic compliances are being taken care of. Compliance with respect to filings, with respect to maintenance of records, displays, uh, you know, uh, so all of these aspects will have to be considered very carefully, and on the basis of that, the management will be able to come to a position as to where the company really stands uh, on the legal front. So that is why it is important to carry out a legal audit. Training and education. Training and education is an important ongoing process in compliance management, where as in every organization, there are employees who join and employees who leave. So when employees join, it is important for them to know what they mean by effective compliance. So there is a learning involved in that. So the employees need to be trained. They need to be educated further. It is a process of ongoing education for employees who are already there. There should be continuous development, and there should be uh, training also on various aspects like workshops on anti-sexual harassment and workshops on non-retaliation in case of sexual harassment. So there are a lot of these aspects which the employees need to be trained on, which the employees need to know before uh, you know before we can say that there is an effective compliance management process in place.
Thank you very much, Christopher. The last part is other practices to be followed for effective compliance effective compliance management. Is we already discussed some of these. Now, having a center of excellence, like we discussed before, uh, ensuring that compliance are getting segregated department-wise, and stakeholders are being provided with the responsibility, being given with the responsibility to ensure compliance with that. Now, second one is periodic risk assessment. Now, how good or bad your company is doing, depending on what are the compliances you think to be priority for your companies. Whether you are faring with those compliances, whether all one-time registrations are in place, whether they are up to date or not. The third and the last one is, of course, documentation and preservation of records. This is important to ensure that your company has been functioning in a compliant manner over the years. To suffice that, to substantiate that in front of a visiting inspector or a member from the authorities, you need to keep all your documentations and records in place. Now, we at Lexplosion, we have come up with a tool which is called Complify. It is there in my CII portal also, which is being provided to various CII members at a very discounted rate, along with a lot of freebies. Now, how Complify tool functions, I'll just spare 1 minute here. So it's a fully automatic compliance solution. As a user, you just need to fill in certain information with regard to your company, where are your locations, what are your employee strength, and pick up your industry. Complify automatically, it churns out your data which you feed in, it churns out the list of laws which are applicable to you and which may applicable to you. It divides the list of laws into two categories. One is definitely applicable and the other is maybe applicable. We also provide summary of laws for you to take read through them in a very short summaries, of course, for you to read through them and understand whether the law is applicable to you or not, and then you can customize your database accordingly. All modules of law, all critical compliances which are given under various modules like HR, tax, corporate, environment, health and safety will get covered under Complify. You can also allocate your tasks by using Complify to designated stakeholders, compliance leads within your organization, and ensure that all of them are easily managed by, because what Complify also does is it sends you ahead of time alerts to ensure that all your compliances, all your critical compliances which are applicable to you are getting complied within a particular time. And as a company head, as a person who is leading the company, who is responsible for all compliances, you get to see reports and from the dashboard itself and from through Complify. So with that, we come to an end of the presentation. Over to you, Mr. B.S. Rao.